Live from the People Forward Network podcast studio at CultureCon in Madison, Wisconsin, this Fringe episode was created to help you grow your perspective around culture and meaningful work. CultureCon believes that every individual, regardless of role, has the power to make work more meaningful for themselves and their organization. Now, here's some inspiration straight from the amazing leaders and workplaces within the CultureCon community.
Hey, it's Nikki, Llewellyn Gregory, and I'm back here at CultureCon Live in Madison, Wisconsin. Faatima Khan is with me, and I just so enjoyed our conversation preparing for this conference. And actually, I remember saying something. It's like bringing back some memories here about, so have you been to CultureCon before? Because I haven't, but my entire team is behind this to create this, and a number of us are coming because we just have fallen in love with the mission of the organization. But I hear you, Faatima, have been involved since really the very beginning. Like you were a speaker.
They were gracious enough to ask me to come out and speak. And so I was kind of earlier on in my career, and I was like, all right, let's go for it. And so they just created such a welcoming environment, and to see it grow tremendously over the years has been just amazing. And I think one of the coolest things is that they've stayed local. Bringing folks back in and reinvesting into the city and the community is pretty awesome. And I really love that they're just kind of taking all the caring power of the community and just injecting it into such an amazing conference that happens every year. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. And you'll just see from the marketing that they put out, Nick and Zach, Nick and Zach are on a first name basis with everyone.
I know.
It's like, what are their last names again? Like they just, everyone
cool.
feels
that's
cool.
That's the piece that's really cool is very rarely do you find that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it's so cool to know that you've been along for the journey and continue to come back. And I think that'll be the plans for us as well. So the topic that we're really leaning into today for our conversation is around authenticity. It is a word, being authentic at work, being human. A lot of people are talking about it, but sometimes it doesn't get into but really, what is that like? And that's what I want to do with you today. Just, being real, being human, being you at work and feeling like you can and being seen for who you are. So I'd love to start with the ways as a leader that we help people to feel that they can show up authentically at work, understanding each person's uniqueness. How have you found in your experiences, maybe you've watched other leaders do this, you've applied things on your own, but how to truly activate helping people to show up as their authentic self at work?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's all about building trust. I think trust is something that, when you talk about authenticity, I really struggle sometimes when people say, well, I just need my employees to show up authentically. And I'm like, well, you haven't created the space or environment or system for them to show up authentically. And so I think a lot of the onus needs to be put on creating that environment. And so I talk a lot about my work about how do we shift from not just creating psychologically safe spaces, but creating brave spaces. And those brave spaces understand that everyone has a unique background, and how do we leverage the strength of individuality and uniqueness. And that really stems from getting to know people on a personal level. And one thing that I do, and I've oftentimes done in my career, and something that I learned from a colleague of mine, Gabe, who I used to work with, is, have you ever heard of a mood elevator?
No.
Okay, so mood elevator is something that we used to post in our offices back when we were in person. And it essentially goes through kind of a number of different terms or phrases. And so they're either in the blue, which is the top section, and I wrote some of these down, but it's grateful, wise, creative, resourceful. The middle level is curious, and then the bottom level is where you get into, when you show up to work and you're a little irritated or worried or angry or stressed out. And so one thing that I oftentimes like to do with my colleagues and my direct reports is to just start off the day with saying, hey, where are you at in your mood elevator? And people will say, I'm curious, or, I'm really stressed out. And that allows me to know, when is it time to communicate? Or, hey, maybe they've got a lot going on and maybe just need some time for self-care. And I think that's a great way to begin to build that trust, because I don't ask employees to go into the details. So, if you've got a lot of personal things going on in your personal life, you don't have to share, but you can if you want to. And so we'll have, we used to do stand-ups in person. And so we had everyone show up, and someone would say, I'm feeling super grateful today to be here. And you knew, hey, if you had a lot on your plate, you could go up to an individual now because you know where they're starting out. that day to say, hey, can you help me out with something? And they would be more inclined to say, yeah, I'm feeling awesome today, happy to help. Whereas if someone says, hey, I'm stressed out, and that's all they have to say, they don't have to go into the details, but all of a sudden, okay, maybe that person just can't give 110 today, and that's okay. And so that's something that's really worked for me.
That's so cool, and a great example of a cultural norm. If all people get to know that coming into this meeting, this is going to be asked of me, like where I'm at. And, we say at People Forward Network, we prioritize excellence over perfection. Like perfection's not even a thing. And excellence every day is different, right?
Yeah.
Like me working through this very hard morning with, a situation where a dog threw up on the carpet. I was like, I'm on my way out and whatever, and it's thrown me off. And then I have to rush into this meeting. It's like, I don't necessarily need to tell them about what happened with the dog, but they know that I'm coming into this right now a little bit scattered or whatever.
Yeah.
Yes, I love that. And I know we're going to be talking about like how to give grace, and we're going to be digging into that a little bit more, as well as trust. You had said, many leaders will say, showing up authentically. We want everyone to do that, but we have to lay the groundwork or the platform. Let's look at this like a staircase. Like we're gonna, work our way up. Someone comes in as a new employee, onboarding. We don't know them yet. They don't know us yet. How do we get started with really building meaningful, authentic efforts together?
I really encourage a lot of just one-on-one meet and greets, no agenda. I think so often we bring on new hires and we're like we got to get through this and this and this and this. And yes, that comes with wanting them to have all the tools to be successful. But I also think we do need to take a step back and say, let's get to know them on a personal level, because when you do build that foundation, you're able to ensure that that individual will be successful down the road. And when you do build that trust. And so an example I can think of is, I'll share a personal example and then an example of someone else. But, early in my career, I'm speaking from, my own personal experience. So I'm of Muslim faith, and in my culture and my community, you oftentimes don't talk back to your elders. And unconsciously, oftentimes you end up lowering your gaze to show respect to others. Now, that's a very different concept than American culture, where if I'm not looking at you eye to eye, you probably think, oh, well, she's not paying attention to me. And when I would go into my one-on-ones with my supervisor, I remember a couple of weeks in, she was like, hey, is everything okay? I said, of course. She said, you're doing amazing work, but you don't look at me. And I had no idea that I was just, out of respect, was lowering my gaze to her. And we had such an awesome discussion. She's like, oh, I would have never known or learned that about you had you not told me. And we since grew so much in that regard. But then also I think about now when I have colleagues, our new hires come on. I recently had a new intern come on, and I asked them, what do you need to be successful? Is there anything I should know or anything, feel comfortable as you go along? And they said, you've been so open with me, but I did want to share, oftentimes in meetings, if I'm fidgeting or playing with something, or if I'm shifting my eyes and things, I have ADHD. And so I just want you to know that I am trying to pay attention. But imagine had they not shared that with me, all of a sudden, 3-4 weeks down the road, they're on a performance improvement plan, XYZ is happening, and it's not their fault, right? But we didn't create the space then for them to show up authentically as their best self, and for us as an employer to make sure that they're successful. And so I think a whole lot has to do with just getting to know someone deeply on that personal level.
I want to give a shout out to the various sides of ownership in all of that and celebrate that, where, the opportunity for curiosity was brought to the table. The leader that you're working with, she could have just assumed and said, oh, she just doesn't like working with me. I guess we'll just get through this, right? So that curious factor, you embrace the feedback. And even the way that you share it right now, you're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea.
Yeah.
I'm so glad. And now I'm able to share that with other people. So just various, forms of bringing our ownership to the table to make things better, also including, hey, I'm going to be proactive and share, hey, this is how I operate, like the ADHD scenario of maybe fidgeting or whatever. Just want you to look out for that. If it's distracting, let me know, but feeling safe enough to be able to share that, which I think leads into, you had mentioned before when we talked how important it is to know people outside of work, know them outside of their role and their skills and how they operate. Maybe fidgeting at work, it applies to being in a meeting. Way outside of that, things that they enjoy doing, past experiences that they've had. How do you do that in a way that maybe the listeners can take and adopt because they feel nervous to be like, I don't want to pry, but how do you do that in a swift or a savvy way?
Yeah. I mean, I think if COVID-19 and the pandemic taught us anything, it's that your work life and your home life can no longer be mutually exclusive, right? You need to, not to say that it's your responsibility to know what's happening in your employee's life, but I think it is important to create that space for them to share should they choose to. And so, I mean, I've worked with colleagues who their, wife had a miscarriage that morning. They still felt like they had to show up at work, I feel like so often we put these pressures on ourselves to show up. And I think that imagine if you had a culture where you felt comfortable enough to go to your supervisor and say, hey, today's a tough day. Can I just take some time? And I think as we progress as a community and we discuss things around mental health and we're more open to feedback and openness, I think that's where we're going to really make moves and move the needle in this space. But I really think a lot of it is leading by example. And the more you are vulnerable, the more someone else is going to lean in. So oftentimes when, I feel like I can't expect anything of my employees unless I demonstrate the same in return. And so one thing that I've always really leaned heavily on is being transparent and vulnerable myself. And so just like I just shared, I oftentimes will lead by sharing my own example of times where I didn't realize I messed up in my career. You learn from your failures, or you say, hey, the eye contact thing, I share that with new hires when they come to say, hey, I didn't realize until someone communicated that with me. And then others feel more comfortable sharing more about themselves as well.
That's so good. And I think to each person's comfort level with what they want to share, right? Everyone's different in that. And I think over time, some want the experience with us to build up before they might share more. But the power of just asking the questions to say that we care and saying only if you feel comfortable, sharing that, giving an out, but, putting the questions out there that say, I do care about you beyond just what we do here. I think that's a powerful thing.
And you got to put work into it. I mean, I have a lot of fun. When I was in person, I had a lot more fun probably because I'm a prankster, so I have a lot of fun there. But I can think of a time where I had a colleague that I worked with, older gentleman. He never he never smiled. And I was like, I am going to work to make this man smile. He did great work, but he would just never smile. And I
cannot wait to hear the prank.
Oh my gosh. I knew very little about him. All I knew was he didn't smile and he ate Cheetos at lunch. And one time in the office, I overheard a conversation of him talking about the movie Rudy. Have you seen that movie?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. So for those that are listening, Rudy is a football movie about a player named Rudy who really wants to play, and he works his butt off, hardest worker on the team, and somehow never gets to play in the game. So the championship game is coming up, and he wants to play, does not see his name on the roster. So, and keep in mind, I hadn't seen this movie before. I just overheard it. So I literally went out, I got the movie. I went home, I watched the whole thing because I was like, I got to figure out what's going on with this colleague. I got to make him smile. So I watched the whole movie and I got to the scene where Rudy didn't make the final cut for the championship game. And the players went to the coach's office. They took off their jerseys and they said, I want Rudy to play. And the coach said, be a captain. He said, I think I am being a captain. He put his jersey down. And the next player came in the room and did the same, and so on and so forth. So I went to Walmart that night and I bought up 40, 50 bags of Cheetos. And I spent all night coordinating 40, 50 calendars to make sure everyone is outside the office when I needed. I went to one of our VPs. I said, could you please call him into a meeting and make sure it's pretend serious. She's like, what are you up to? Because she always knew I was up to something. So she calls him in and says something to the effect of, the CEO really needs some metrics on something. So in that time, I coordinate 40, 50 employees outside the door. And I knocked, I walked in, he had this look in his face, why are you interrupting my one-on-one with the VP? And I said, I know we've gone through a lot of change lately and it's really tense around here, but I just wanted to say, thanks, coach. And I stuck out my hand with the bag of Cheetos and I dropped it in the middle of the table and I turned around and walked out. And then the next colleague went in, knocked into the same thing. And over the course of probably a half an hour, the whole table started just piling out with bags of Cheetos. And it was the funniest thing. And afterwards, he called me into the stairwell and he said, "Could we have a word, please?" And I was so terrified. It's like, okay. And you're at the stairwell. And he said, "I want to thank you." And he said, "You have no idea." And now I'm going to get emotional. He said, "You have no idea what I've been going through." And he said, one of my best friends has cancer and he's dying. And you have no idea how much I needed that today. So when I say put work into it, you got to really put work into it, because you have no idea how much people need you to show up as your best self each day. And if you can't give 110 in, if your colleague can for you, that's what culture work is all about for me.
That's so good. I was going to ask if you got a belly laugh rather than a smile from him. But then I was like, hold on, it just went this other way and I'm tearing up. So I hope you got all of the emotions in that. It sounds like it. That's a really cool story.
Yeah, we've both since moved on to different jobs and we stay in contact and we see each other around town. And you think about the trust that is built from those small efforts that
Yeah. That's been a theme on the series that we're doing for CultureCon Live is the small efforts, the 5-minute conversations.
Yeah.
Like, we don't need to wait till the schedule frees up and we find the white space. It's like just a 5-minute conversation or sometimes an audio text just to say, I was just checking in.
Yeah.
The simple efforts. So as we said in the beginning, or I was sharing, authenticity a lot of times is overused and maybe not as spelled out on what that can really look like lived out. Let's do the same thing with trust, because you've mentioned it a couple times, and part of being authentic is you have to trust the place and the people. And so maybe share with us some of the ways, illustrate trust lived out, and maybe just challenge us to try some new things with how we're building trust on our teams.
Yeah, I think trust is really about action. And I think that for me, the trust that I have in leaders and good leaders are the ones that advocate for me in spaces that I'm not in. And so when word comes back around and I'm like, oh, so-and-so mentioned you in a meeting, that's when I know that my leader is actually advocating for me. Or, when you get a kudos from the CEO and you wonder, I wonder how they found out about that. Well, hey, your supervisor is really advocating for you in that instance. And so I really think that trust is built through action, because sometimes you can say all the right things, but when nothing moves, then you sit there and wonder, well, maybe it's just a lot of, talk.
There's so much power in that, even beyond the leader and the direct team member. But as a team, if you think back, or I think back, right, in reflection of the tightest team dynamic I ever had, whether it was work or sport or whatever, it's that I got your back. You can trust that no matter what, in any circumstance, they're going to stand up for you. Dear friends do. And
yeah, and you mentioned the word power. I think power and privilege are so important, because when you do work your way up in your career, you get a lot of power, and with privilege comes power, and it's how do you use your power and your voice when it comes to those moments. So when you do get the titles and you move up in your career, how do you then use your power and privilege to advocate for those that aren't there yet? How do you open doors and bring people along with you as well? I think that's so important.
One of the things that I love to work against in any episode that I have, whenever I have the opportunity, is the corporate ego thing that is so real, right? It's I don't know who made that up or where it came from, but I love to remind us, where did we get here?
Yeah.
With how we have to posture and show up perfect and, whatever. My day is always great and I'm able to be 110% the same way every day, almost pursuing perfection. So when we talked before, you said grace in the workplace is really powerful and helps really lean into living out authentic leadership. What does that look like?
Yeah, I feel I work in the DEI space, and so I think my mind immediately went to empathy. And I think it's just that basic understanding that life happens and you can't just assume this person, change happened to them, right? There's so much that's also out of people's controls. And so I think there's a lot of, one thing I will say that we're focused on right now is around caregiving. You have so much going on in your life, and I work for a remote first company, and I think there's a huge piece of culture that is hard to create in a remote first environment. But also I think that we give each other grace in the sense that because we work remotely, for example, my mom has an autoimmune disease. And so I am able to be there and support her when I need to be. That gives me the flexibility, right? And my leaders have grace with me when something comes up. And I think that's so, so important because formerly when I was in other roles, I felt like I had to, if something was going on at home or if someone needed to be taken to a hospital visit, I felt like I couldn't drop the ball at work. And so I think that we really need to make sure that we do have more grace with folks to understand, oftentimes kind of, not to say that, again, we need to know everything that's going on in their personal lives, but we do really need to make sure that we create the space and flexibility for them to show up for their families. I'm a firm believer that your family comes first and then comes everything else. But I also understand that, if you're not making money to put food on the table, times are hard, right? And so I think that culture work is so important after we get through the basics. I think people need to make enough money to put food on their table. They need to feel secure. They need to have the wellness benefits. They need to have all those things. And then you get to a place of culture and trust. And I guess what I'm trying to say is the most success I've had in my career is with having grace with people, because when people say, hey, I'm really struggling because I don't know how I'm going to have a child, or I'm planning to have a child, but I don't know how I'm going to afford childcare. Can we talk through that? That's an amazing thing to have that trust built. Mm-hmm. And that's a very serious conversation. And that also makes you reconsider, well, how do I best support this person, not just as an employee, but as a human being? And so if I can't support them because compensation is outside of my control, well, then how am I going to make sure that I do everything from creating opportunities for them professionally within the workplace? I grow them in ways that they want to, so that even if they're not going to stay with the company, they're going to be successful beyond it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the piece that I really do think we need to get to know people on a personal level, because they're going to be your brand ambassadors. They're going to leave, even if they leave your organization, they're going to be like, wow, they treated me with so much grace and respect and kindness and poured into me. And now you've got a brand ambassador who's going to be talking about your company out in the community and bringing in more talent down the road as well. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes we're really focused on the short term and not the long term goals. And I think there's so much there as well.
Oh, so much in that. I feel like we could create a series together to break it all down, but just such great examples. And you were talking about how you are a remote first company and there's some challenges. There's also great opportunity with that. One thing that I have learned is if we can help to make it very clear on the roles of all of our people, right? Things do change. And so constant clarity, not just on here's what we set out to do, but things do change. This is the role you're here to own, and here are the goals you're working on, and to be able to give the ownership of that flexibility to be able to accommodate the life that they have. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of workplaces maybe in that corporate ego situation that it's this command and control thing versus let's help them to truly own this. And then outside of that and being able to use that flexibility and just trust that we give them is helping and modeling the way of this first. Asking for modifications and changes. Like, I know we said like this goal and we've been working towards it, but I'm about 3 weeks out and I'm just seeing that there's just going to be no way. Like, can I get your support in adding like a 2-week extension on this? So that there is that's grace meets like just a human need and honoring what is needed there. But for some reason, I think people feel like because of the lack of maybe authenticity or trust, they can't speak up. And then it's like they're losing sleep, working crazy hours, and it's just super unhealthy. But how do we build that for, and modeling the way of like, I don't know the answer. I'm not going to meet the deadline. Like, and so that other people can follow suit there and speak up and ask for help. We know we need it. So I do want to touch on how you apply your equity lens to what you're doing and why that is so important. And the opposite would be like a one size fits all. Like, here's what we do here and here's how we do it. But because of the personal relationships and getting to know each other, you come from this like DEI space, which I'm about to ask you a little bit more about your role. But, tell us more about that, like how you do that from that that equity lens, if you will?
So I work in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and I think it's so important when we talk about culture work as well because of exactly what you just said. There is no one size, approach to say that, hey, if we throw a happy hour after work, like employees are going to be super thrilled. Well, does everyone drink alcohol? I don't know. Are we taking those intentional pauses to ask all the questions? So who is your audience? What is the makeup of your audience? And I think it really goes back to asking your employees. And so I truly believe that we need to amplify the voice of our underrepresented staff whose voices aren't always heard. And so if you have an organization where you have fewer people of color, fewer women leaders, how are we making sure that their voices are heard as well? And that you're not always hearing maybe more of your extroverted staff in the room, their voices. And so equity work is really all about that and making sure that we understand people. Kind of the whole purpose of this kind of podcast session is like, how do we make sure that we get to know people on a personal level, but also make sure that they have the tools they need to be successful? Mm-hmm. And one thing that I've done where I work is that we have done some trainings on applying the equity lens. And so it is kind of like a loose guide. They have many around town. They have many at universities. The city of Madison has created one as well, but it's an equity lens tool. And then basically you apply it to any project, any initiative. So when you are rolling something new out, you go through and you ask your questions of, who is your audience? How will they be impacted? If you think of an example, when I first learned about an equity tool, I was taught with the idea of a city in mind. For example, maybe you're looking at a neighborhood and someone says, oh, well, we really need to destroy this building and build a playground. And that's going to be super helpful for the whole community. Well, before you do that, how do you ask the neighbors if that's what they want? Who is using that current facility that you want to tear down? What are the impacts? All those questions. So how do you take that intentional pause to really ask folks what they want? And then also understand kind of all of the breakdown. So is it a location that's on a bus line so people can get to it? All of those different dynamics. And so that's what equity is really about, is how do we make sure that we're supporting from a holistic standpoint everyone in the community, not just a certain population.
I think the theme of most every example that you shared today challenges us as leaders to slow down in the efforts that we're doing so that we can really take time to have more conversation and ask more questions. And there's no relationship that, when you truly have a relationship, it's taken time to get there. And going back to my question on like let's walk the staircase, you can take those first steps in onboarding that are super intentional, but it's these constant efforts at every step that says, I'm stopping to hear you and to spend time like in reflection on what you're saying. I'm going to follow up, and just the key takeaway in all of it is like, take your time.
Yeah, take your time. And one of the things that we do really well is we work in an agile methodology, which is a project management style, but it is very much, it lends itself just to that. It's how do you take those intentional pauses to meet with folks? And so we have the daily huddles. We work in 2-week sprints. And so we take projects incrementally. We check in with our stakeholders and our customers regularly to say, hey, we only worked on this for a week, but how are you feeling about it? Is it the same direction you wanted? Did we take it a different direction? And then we pivot. And so we're constantly pausing, reflecting, gathering feedback, and then moving forward. And I think that's such a better way to approach the work that you can do rather than having a customer say, oh, I asked you to do this. You spend months on it. And then you show them your end product and it's not at all what they wanted. Mm-hmm. And so I completely agree. Taking those intentional pauses is so, so helpful.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for the time. Thank you so much for being a supporter of CultureCon and probably inviting many, many people, because I just hear you raving about just the feedback that you've given. I'm so excited to be here for my first time. Before you go, I'd love to make sure that people know what you're doing today in your DEI role, where you're at, and then we'll probably have multiple conversations down the road, but leave us with that.
Thank you. So I currently serve as the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion and community engagement at WPS, a health solutions company in Madison, Wisconsin. We do have employees remotely across various different states. And in my role, I'm just really privileged to be able to do a lot of the cultural work that we spoke about today. And one of the main kind of avenues in which I'm able to do that is through our employee resource groups at WPS. And so we have various groups from our women's focused ERG to our ABLE ERG that focuses on disability and mental health inclusion and so on and so forth. And so these groups are just amazing at pushing the needle in the DEI space and creating just a better workplace environment for everyone.